As we continue to journey through this pandemic, we hear references every day to the important, courageous, and compassionate role that frontline workers are playing to keep us as safe and healthy as possible. We sometimes forget, however, that references to the front lines actually find their origin in military conflicts. That is, when armies line up against each other or dig themselves into trenches. Those on the front lines are those who are the closest to the opposing side and, as such, at greatest risk. One of the plaques in the sanctuary at St. Andrew's Church tells the story of a brilliant and courageous young doctor who served quite literally on the front lines during the First World War. It's a story that's actually a significant part of Canadian medical history, even though many of us might not know very much about the work that was done by Lawrence Bruce Robertson, in whose honor this plaque hangs on the wall of our church. Robertson was born on September the 6th, 1885 in Toronto. He was the third son of Alexander James Robertson and Julia Dalmage Curry. He was educated in Toronto and graduated from the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto in 1909. He interned in surgery at the Toronto Hospital for Sick Children before spending a year and a half in pediatric and orthopedic surgery at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, and 6 months as a surgeon at the Children's Hospital in Boston. In 1913, Dr. Robertson returned to Toronto, where he continued to work as a surgeon and pathologist at the Hospital for Sick Children and at the University of Toronto. In November 1914, shortly after the beginning of the First World War, Dr. Robertson enlisted and initially served in the hospital at the training camp on the Toronto Exhibition Grounds. And then, in April 1915, he set out for the front lines in Europe. Dr. Robertson was stationed at No. 2 Canadian Casualty Clearing Station, where casualties would be initially brought to be treated and stabilized before being transported to hospitals for further treatment and recovery much farther from the front. Historians recount that in 1917 alone, 30,000 casualties from the front lines were treated at that frontline hospital, and Robertson was said to have worked tirelessly, often putting in 16-hour days if not longer. It was while serving in that military hospital on the front lines that Robertson began to apply some of the new techniques that he had learned, that he'd worked on and developed during his training and postings in the United States and Canada. There are some indications that he had learned some of those techniques while working at the hospital in New York City and Boston. But since the Americans had not yet entered the war, and many of the techniques had not been attempted on the front lines, Dr. Robertson's work was truly groundbreaking. As the plaque in the sanctuary attests, Dr. Robertson's most significant contributions related to blood transfusion techniques that quite literally saved thousands of lives of young soldiers who had suffered shrapnel wounds and other war-related injuries. He shared his work with other medical personnel and became recognized as one of the leading experts on these developing techniques which allowed whole blood to be transfused into the recipient without the need for the donor to be immediately present. As the plaque in the sanctuary states, he first introduced into the British Army in this period a practicable method of blood transfusion and later evolved the surgical treatment known as exsanguination transfusion, through which the lives of many, notably of little children, have been preserved. It's interesting to note that modern blood banks and blood storage techniques can trace much of their history to the development of these medical procedures. Letters can be found from a number of his patients who attested to the role that he had played in saving their lives, particularly because Dr. Robertson encouraged his patients to keep in touch with him so that he could track their post-operative recovery processes, even long after they had been transferred out of the frontline casualty clearing station. Upon his return from Europe in 1918, Dr. Robertson continued his work with the Hospital for Sick Children and the University of Toronto, and did significant work with blood transfusions for children who had suffered from severe burns, in part with the desire to find ways to reduce the possibility of blood-related infections, many of which would otherwise have been toxic. He married Enid Gordon Finley in 1920, who herself would go on to make a remarkable contribution to our country, since she is often credited as being one of the founders of physiotherapy in Canada. Sadly, in February 1923, Lawrence Bruce Robertson was struck with a case of influenza that led to his hospitalization. He seemed to have recovered, but later developed pneumonia and passed away on February the 24th, 1923. He was only 37 years old when he died, yet he had used his gifts and skills to save thousands of soldiers on the battlefields of Europe, to save the lives of countless young children, and to become the founder of Canadian blood banking and transfusion medicine. Dr. Andrew Beckett, who is a veteran combat surgeon with the Canadian Forces, notes that techniques that Robertson pioneered in the First World War continued to exert an influence on the care of soldiers on the battlefields in modern conflicts such as those in Iraq and Afghanistan. Dr. Beckett has stated that in terms of combat casualty care, his work is probably one of the greatest contributions ever made. Enid Gordon Finley and Lawrence Bruce Robertson had two children, a son and a daughter. Their son Alan was the husband of K. Bruce Robertson, who is a member of our congregation still, and the grandfather of Erica Cook, who is a member of St. Andrews and known to many, as is his great-granddaughter Jessie Cook. And today's reader, Arthur Cook, who grew up in the congregation and is now living in Kingston, Ontario, is Lawrence Bruce Robertson's great-grandson. To conclude, we have asked Arthur to read words that are found on the bottom of the plaque in the sanctuary that honors this remarkable, gifted, courageous young surgeon, whose dedication was such a blessing to so many, right there on the front lines.
I want to sing you a song of men who live and struggle and die, each one aflame with the living fire, striving to plant just a little higher the feet of posterity. Higher to power, to greatness of soul, to beauty and wisdom and light. What though the path may be stormy and cold, what though I gain a foot or a mold, the object is worthy the fight.